Hello, and welcome to another edition of Sony Pro Life. My name is Deon LeCointe. I am the Senior Manager for Sports and IP Solutions here at Sony Electronics, our Professional Solutions of America division. And today's session for the Sony Pro Live event is High Dynamic Range, or HDR as most people refer to it. It's really become a pretty significant buzzword in our industry, whether you're on the cinematic side of the business, broadcast, or live event side. It's really presented itself as a technology or a form of acquisition that allows live event content creators to really deliver a high impact image to end users who are viewing their content at home. Now, for the cinematic perspective, HDR has actually been in use for quite some time. It's only because of recent developments in technology that live event producers and content creators can take advantage of the HDR acquisition method and deliver their live events to the home. So today's high dynamic range session isn't going to be purely focused on the academics of HDR. You are going to get some of that, but we really wanted to bring, let's call it high dynamic range for the layperson to you, our end users, who are primarily focused on creating live events and producing live content. So in addition to our academics, in addition to the practical applications and who is doing HDR today, we're also going to open up a time slot during this session for question and answers. So feel free to use your interface to submit some questions. If we have time, we will address them as best as we can. But I'd like to welcome my guest, Robert Willox, who is the Senior Manager in charge of marketing here at Professional Solutions of America for Sony. Welcome, Rob. Glad to have you.
Glad to be here. Thank you very much for asking me to join today.
Oh, no problem. I think this is going to be something that's very beneficial to our viewers. We know that, like I said, HDR is becoming a real buzzword. It's something that people want to understand better. They want to know how they can do it, and they want to know what's the real impact of it. So let's get started. What is HDR? For the layperson term definition, what is HDR?
Well, the ability to image in the high dynamic range is being able to capture the blackest blacks right through to the whitest whites without having to make any image compromises along the way.
Mm-hmm.
You know, television cameras for broadcast had traditionally not offered an awful lot of headroom or the ability to go into the whites because of the limitations of the transmission system.
Mm-hmm.
So we would employ circuitry to ensure that cameras had a relatively narrow dynamic range, and if we exceeded that, we would start showing artifacts. While that's perfectly fine for the broadcast area, you know, for cinematography, where ostensibly you have the most critical and discerning eyes, and you want to preserve history for all time. You know, we're going back into Sony Pictures archive now and taking films that are 50 and 60 years old, remastering them again and putting them through an HDR process, and they continue to live on. So their images have to be, you know, spot on to start with and have headroom to grow.
Mm-hmm.
This same idea and the technology developed for the cinema business is now being applied to the live television business. So now that we have very high bit digital recorders, we could work at 4K, we can work in Rec 2020. We're starting to get very interested in preserving these images in their highest form for all time. We're also wanting to present a unique viewer experience and try to go from, you know, I've got a 14-year-old, so Friday Night Lights has become Friday Night Tablet. And we'd like to get the tablet users back to watching our big small screen, if you will. And to do that, we need to provide a viewer experience that is better. And you know, television moves on always. You know, with the death of Muhammad Ali, we saw all of this newsreel footage and what those images of the 60s and 50s looked like, and they're very dated to that time. And television continually moves forward. The images of the 70s, 80s, and 90s all are evolving, where today we have the, again, you know, 4K and great big color, and we'll have images for the new millennia. And this is just the next step in that imaging. And we're also planting the seeds for the 8K world and what that can bring. So there's a lot of very exciting things happening in imaging, and HDR, I think, is the most exciting thing happening now.
Got you. And that's something I definitely want us to talk about today, because we are looking at a transition, because there's a lot of people that are transitioning to 4K. HDR is now a topic of conversation as well. And 8K is often the future. I'd really like for us to touch upon, how the combination of 4K and HDR really delivers something that's very powerful from a content producer and live event creator or content creator perspective.
Well, I think it's really important that the tools that we develop for 4K just aren't specific to 4K television or just 4K standard dynamic range.
Sure.
So what we've developed with our toolkits, our cinema cameras have been 4K for some time and have recorded 16-bit for some time. The television cameras now are moving into the realm where we need to do multi-camera live 4K. Consumer forecasts every year for 4K televisions are smashed.
Sure.
We sell way more than we ever dreamed that we could. And we need UHD content for that. And then this idea that we're going to put a negative on the shelf, and we're still watching Seinfeld that has been remastered in HD. We'll be taking these 4K shows and remastering them for some time, and it's important that they have the headroom to be appropriate for the televisions of the future. So
Yeah.
the ability of a 4K camera to be a multi-faceted tool, plus also respect the larger broadcast, which is high definition today, and be not only a great 4K camera, but also a great HD camera, is really paramount to what we're introducing, whether it's a camera, a switcher, storage device, or monitor. So it's that wide tool set, I think that's very compelling. And we're trying to think that, as a content producer now, you're throwing a dart as far as you can into the future when you're purchasing equipment. And, we feel that it's very important that we give you the maximum amount of return on investment for that. So, and we like making great stuff.
Yeah, we generally do a good job of that.
Yeah.
Okay. So why do you think there is such a strong desire? Let's talk sports. Let's talk live events, which primarily means sports. And I think a lot of our viewers are going to be coming from a sports background. Why do you think there's such a strong desire for HDR acquisition and HDR production now?
Well, part of it is scripted television is just that. It's very planned. It's very regimented. It's a very efficient process that there's nothing really that's a surprise on the day of a production. The lighting's set, the camera angles are set, everything's blocked. You know where you're going to go into post-production. It's a very well-established and regimented, efficient process.
Yeah.
Live TV is as efficient as it is, still relies on the action on the field, and the only known quantity is the action is going to happen somewhere out here.
Okay.
But what is actually going to happen and how we're going to record it is really up to chance and circumstance. Very good producers have a good feeling for how a play is going to develop, but you can't predict interceptions or fumbles or tip shots.
If we could, my fantasy team would be doing much better now.
Yeah, mine too, after last weekend. So the ability to have cameras that can be very dynamic in those environments are important. So, my example here is we have to appreciate that you cannot see a high dynamic range on your computer screen. So we've simulated some images. But in the worst of circumstances, and this used to be true of the old stadium in Arlington, where you had that great big shaft in the roof, and you'd play the game in November, and it would just be terrible. Even this weekend in Texas, looking back into the sun was very, very challenging for television cameras. So you have this enormous difference between your whitest white and your darkest dark. So to be able to expose for that, you expose for really what's important, which is going to be the on plane surface action, but the rest of it's going to be kind of lost. So the idea of a high dynamic range camera is going to be able to bring out the details both in the shadows, control the whites, let the camera have a more natural tonality through it, and offer pictures to the viewer that are more lifelike and more really what like what your eye sees. Everything that 3D wanted to do, that depth and that fun, we're trying to do here really in HDR. I have another example, and it's not sports, but it gives you a representation of what we're trying to achieve. So in this picture, what's really important is the color and the vibrancy of the fall foliage and the shadow depth in the trees, and you get the idea that this is a very wide expanse. But for me to get that exposure here, I've got to make some creative choices. In this case, I'm just gonna, it's later in the afternoon, I'm gonna have to let that sun overexpose. And hope I can get some of that back in post, which is the key thought. If I did expose for the sky here, I would lose everything that's important in that shot.
Yeah.
So what I can do, and in this case in Photoshop, and again, this is very rough, is I can create a layer of best of both worlds. So in one pass I can expose for the sky, and the other pass I can expose for the rest of it, and I could do multiple layers. But the key to that is it's all done post-camera. So for us to do things live, we need to be able to do that on the day and camera first without processing in the back end. And just a refresher on the types of things that we're trying to get out of HDR images, and there's a slight difference between the right and left. And again, appreciate that you don't have an HDR monitor, is we're trying to get the shadows and the highlights without blowing out the highlights. We're trying to get the color in the shadows, because you can't have color without light.
Yeah.
But most cameras now don't, most cameras designed for television broadcast of the last generation don't do a particularly good job of color, and it's just a function of Rec. 709.
Sure.
And the limited dynamic range of those cameras. So you want to get the image to pop and hold exposure and have something that's more lifelike and vibrant. The other part of this, and color without light or light without color, is in the 4K television system, we changed from BT709 to Rec. 2020, and this is a volumetric graph on the difference in size of the color container that we have for these two systems. So this is 709, and to the right is a picture in 709 of the exposure choice that you'd have to make in the picture. And between high dynamic range and this huge volume in color, now I can expose over a much more difficult scene and still retain all of the details that I want to present to my audience. So you really get an incredible difference. And we shot a few different concert scenes, and one of them was Katy Perry, and her show is lasers and costumes and balloons, and some concerts generally aren't lit to show the audience within the concert. So the HDR brings such a difference to that. It's again much more lifelike, much more vibrant, and you feel much more part of what's happening within the image.
Which has always been kind of the key, is how do you immerse the end user in the event? And I think to Katy Perry's credit, and to a number of other entertainers that are out there, she puts on a really serious show. And
absolutely.
The lasers and the confetti and the screens that are going on behind her, and the dancers and performers that are on the stage that are all in colorful garb, it's something to behold. And I think HDR really did a great job of bringing that punch and that lifelike feel to the end user who's watching it on the screen.
So you have a really compelling artistic reason to do it, and the other reason is actually a business reason. So now you also have a new and highly desirable distribution copy, whether it's going to be for Ultra Blu-ray, which will handle 4K HDR, or it's for one of the over-the-top services. It's an extra bite of that apple, and then you've got this archive that can live on.
Okay. Well, there are some other terms in the market today as it relates to HDR. We've heard things like EOTF. We've heard of OETF.
Yeah.
What do those mean?
So the OETF is, at its simplest, is the optical to electrical transfer function. So how do we get the light that's coming into the lens and being captured by a CMOS or CCD device, how do we put that onto a signal that we can store? So whether it's a RAW or an XAVC, what type of curve do I need to apply to that information to properly map it on my my memory and be able to recover that later. And the EOTF is the opposite. So it's the electro to optical transfer function. So what does the monitor do with this information? What type of curve does it apply to this entropy to be able to display it in the way that was intended
Sure.
by the cinematographer or by the live crew? So I want this to look effectively mimic what I've recorded in the field I want to be able to display, and it's really as simple as that. There's various ways that this happens. There's a curve applied to normal video now. We're just applying it in a different way to be able to realize this capability.
Understood. So it's not to be considered compression or anything like that. It's really a translation, because I think you have it there on your slide. You're going from brightness, a value of brightness to data,
Yeah.
and from that data back to a value of brightness. So
Correct.
it's a one-to-one translation, but it's really for transmission of that data through the system for display.
Correct, and every display may have a unique quality to it that it's going to take your data and put some sort of curve on it to be able to most accurately display your intent.
Understood. Okay.
But it's not not necessarily a one-size-fits-all type of approach. Most monitors will have something unique about them.
Understood. Are there standards, or are there standards out there right now? Because EOTF, OETF, from a scientific perspective, seems like a very broad term. Are there standards that, like you just said, not one size fits all,
Yeah.
that leverages these transfer functions?
Well, there's a few of them here. So we have 2084, which is PQ standard, and we've been using this in dramatic or post-produced applications for some time. So we use this for packaged media, or what we're creating for over-the-top broadcasts, for example, or other media. That is a display-related curve. So it was intended to say, okay, we would have a display that's capable up to X brightness, and we will map everything within that and move forward. We also have emerging curves called HLG, or hybrid log gamma. And it's a different type of curve developed by the NHK, the broadcaster in Japan.
Okay.
And there's a version of that also developed by the British Broadcasting Corporation, which is a way of mapping, it's a scene-specific curve. So I would paint a specific volume of color and exposure to be able to fit into what I see is what I get effectively.
Yeah.
And which is what we need for live. So Dolby is working on different flavors that would also be appropriate for live, but as it stands now, HLG has been used in a lot of these tests.
Sure.
And we also have to separate what's a production HDR curve and what's a distribution HDR curve. And as mentioned, that 2084 has been used more as a distribution, and we're capturing in RAW.
Yeah.
And really it's been used as the EOTF rather than, in the case of HLG, it's being used both as a EOTF and OETF.
Understood. Okay.
And we have our own flavor that we developed called S-Log, which is a curve that we developed back starting in 2007 to be able to get high dynamic range or more contrast ratio recorded in our digital cinema cameras. And we've gone through an evolution, a 9-year journey with that to where it is today. So that curve has been designed to optimize the characteristics of our CMOS or CCD devices to be able to capture their maximum dynamic range and be able to most accurately represent that to whatever recording methodology we use. And it's come in very, very handy as a method for live.
Yeah.
Overall. So that's more of a Sony spin on it, but we know we manufacture our cameras, we manufacture the CCDs, we
Sure.
manufacture all the devices in between. So having a known curve like that makes it easy for us to work on it. And if you've done all the kind of proof of concept in ostensibly for the most discerning image creation people in the business, it's great to use that trickle-down technology within the live arena.
Within the live environment.
Yeah.
Okay. And how does that relate to the concept of S-gamut in the form of color space and things like that?
Well, the cool thing, S-gamut, is that the difference between 709, which is the very small red triangle in here, if you can see it, versus the entire color container that Rec 2020 can be, is that S-gamut gives us a footprint to capture an enormous amount of it. It's very difficult to come up with an imaging device that can process that entire space. And you don't want to start off with a color standard that you've already exceeded with your devices. So this is something to strive for, but we can record the majority of that Rec 2020 color space using S-gamut. So this was designed with feature laser technology in mind, and to give us really the biggest footprint possible that our devices currently can do for archive.
Understood. Okay, so if that's the crux of the sampling of the academics of high dynamic range, let's talk about some of the practical implementations.
Okay.
Can we talk to, and I'm looking at my notes here, can we talk to the high dynamic range workflow and do maybe a comparison between what you might find in a cinematic workflow versus a live workflow?
Okay. This is extremely simplified, so I don't mean to oversimplify what some very, very technical and very, very talented imaging people can do. But at its essence, what you're doing is, you create the high dynamic range in your camera. I can't create it afterwards, so I need to start with something that's got a lot of f-stop capture capabilities. So, and I also need to capture that on a storage medium that I can accurately reproduce everything that I've captured through my CCD block. So we have that with our cinema cameras, f65 and f55s, very, very wide color bandwidth and a lot of dynamic range. From that information goes to a technical grading. So, and your first level of OETF here. So they do a LUT, which is a lookup table on your entropy, and just do a simple lift gamma gain. So they've corrected for your exposure, they've got your imaging into a comfort area where now it can move on to a creative grading process. So this is what is the intent of the shot. I want this to be moody, I want this to be happy, I want this to be colorful, I want this to be very somber. All of those creative decisions would now go into that. And that process, as far as the movie making process, never ends.
Yeah.
They just run out of time.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that is an ongoing process, and will live on right to the moment that they need to make a finish reel for that. So with this now, you can go to the a distribution curve, and you could either finish it in a standard dynamic range color space, or you could color space and curve, or you can finish it for HDR, and you'll have multiple deliverables from that master. So at its most basic, and we've got two flavors that we use on this, and one of them is working with RAW, and working with 4K RAW data it's an enormous amount of data. 24 frames per second of 4K RAW starts adding up very, very quickly.
Sure.
So if you're doing a motion picture and you've got quite a large budget, and you're going to be working with big servers, big storage, they're used to this process already. There's been tons of movies done using 4K RAW. And it's one path, but the tools are very bespoke. They're very, very high end, and it is the thing of a major motion picture release. The second path is to use an existing production format, in this case XAVC, as the container for that HDR. So we would use a map that would put the HDR over XAVC. We take that through the same process, a technical grading, a creative grading, and then you would distribute. And this S-Log on XAVC represents a lower cost alternative to using the raw data, and it's offshoot of this that we're using for live.
Okay.
Okay.
It's interesting that the terminology there being that there's high dynamic range and I guess SDR, standard dynamic range,
Yes.
which I guess people have been operating in standard dynamic range for the whole time and we didn't even know it. So now that we're with the introduction of HDR,
Yeah.
people get that there's SDR and HDR. Okay.
Well, and it's interesting because, again, we said that we really can't create HDR from an SDR.
Yeah.
You know, it becomes a creative choice up front that we're going to capture and then make these creative choices and financial choices downstream.
Definitely a top-down
Yeah.
approach. You capture it the best you can and derive what you can afterwards.
So those two block diagrams really just fall into the where I've got the scope of our professional products is basically acquisition through the post-production process and then conversion to create a master. After that is your distribution, which is completely up to who's going to be getting it, and that's really going to be the post-production house or something like the Sony DADC, which
Sure.
would create a number of different masters to serve a number of different clients.
Okay.
I think remember sitting through the final mastering and distribution of Moneyball, and they had 53 different deliverables for that one movie. So this just is additive
Wow.
on top of them. So they've got quite a job. But there is a difference between the HDR curves that we're doing as part of the production process versus what we're doing as part of the distribution
Okay.
process.
Yes.
Okay. For live. So we've had the benefit of doing a number of different experiments this year. I'll go through the case for the Sony Open, but we've done an awful lot of golf, and the reason for golf is it presents a very challenging environment. You've got sand, grass, sky, some of the wildest outfits that you'd ever see on human beings.
Yeah.
Highly saturated greens, highly saturated pinks. People are generally walking around with white caps on in blinding sunlight, but you want to see what they're doing, in a sand trap. So it presents a lot of very practical challenges that could take full advantage of HDR.
Yeah.
And if you're standing, with a camera watching somebody take a putt and be able to see the sheen in the grass, and with 4K and with the 20/20 color space, be able to see which way the grass is leaning and the shadow detail, and be able to see some of the curvature of the green. It's really quite exciting. So that's why we've been concentrating our effort there. We had a small event in Rio last month too that we had.
Pretty small.
We did work with the broadcaster to provide, again, and this was broadcast in the U.S. for an HDR version of the opening ceremony. So
Sure.
it was 6 cameras, its own production as it, they're preparing for 2020, and the Olympics is always a wonderful proving ground because the next one's got to be bigger, grander, look better. And if anybody watched coverage of the Olympics, you saw tenfold the amount of super motion cameras, really from a viewing standpoint, the engagement and the storytelling because of the choice of cameras and what those cameras can do is, I think, really elevated
Sure.
the game.
Wow.
So these are the people that we've been working with and the reasons we've been working with them. So for Sony Open, as an experiment, we did a single hole, a par 3 with 4 cameras. And I had to respect the main broadcast, which is the Golf Channel coverage in HD. And I wanted to piggyback on top of that coverage with a 4K HDR. So on that hole, I substituted the HD cameras with these 4K cameras, provided Golf Channel with the HD output of the camera system while I took the 4K HDR output and put that to a different switcher and a different set of recorders. So what's important here was I was able to get 2 broadcasts out of the same camera systems using the same announcers, and all I was doing was mimicking the switching. But same camera positions, same operators,
Oh, wow.
same commentators, all those reasons where 3D, as wonderful as 3D was, fell apart, right?
Yeah.
Because 3D needed unique angles, additional equipment, additional operators, additional commentators. And I think we discussed earlier that commentators, everybody kind of takes for granted, but if you take some of the commentators away from the broadcast, you take a Troy Aikman away from a broadcast, the body of experience that you lose and the viewer engagement that you lose because you don't have the expert or the A-team calling a game is quite substantial, and it was a reason that why 3D wasn't happening. This is actually really cool because this just allows for a marginal increase in equipment costs, but I'm not changing my travel entertainment and lodging and everything else.
Same
remains
production, same
the
workflow.
Yeah,
two
and
outcomes.
I get two different shows out of it, which is great. So that was the Sony Open case. And what makes that one camera, two output scenario work is we've got a device called a broadcast processing unit. But what that allows me to do is paint for HD and paint for the HDR from the same panel.
Yeah.
So I would get my maximum exposure, which is going to be my HDR feed, and then I would trim from that for the HD feed. So I can use, again, one operator, one set of equipment, one camera, but get the two signals and then have a very distinct signal path for the HDR and HD. Because you're going to have some markets are going to be a little farther ahead, and so there's going to be reasons why you want to be able to do both. And even something as simple as in stadium, I may end up having an HDR large screen. So somebody may purchase a C-LED panel, for example, which would allow us to do HDR within stadium, which would be fantastic. Right?
Yes.
10 times the brightness on the screen in stadium would absolutely, again, reason to go to the game. So, but it would allow me to use the same cameras for the broadcast, for the in-house monitors, as well as that screen. So it's very exciting.
Got you.
Yeah, not easy, but really cool.
Sure. Well, I think you mentioned earlier about the fact that there are log curves which represent the OETF, and you mentioned our S-log curve. So, and I think you went into a little bit of detail on the S-log curve, but why does it make so much sense to use something like an S-log 3 curve for the live production before you go to your distribution curve, which could be an HLG or a 2084 or something along those lines?
Yeah, from an equipment manufacturing standpoint, we know what CCD or imaging device CMOS that we're going to use and its characteristics, and we know the recording characteristics and the raw signals that are going to go from the camera to the switcher through storage, and we can optimize them using this S-log type of curve. So the roots of this actually is the Kodak sitting on curve from quite a while ago that we've improved for different purposes as we've needed, but it would allow us to map 1300% dynamic range. And just to put that in perspective, so an SD studio camera on its best day could probably do around 400%. So it had a once you started overexposing, it got into whites and you started making a lot of big image compromises. With the size of the footprint that we've got now, the ability to be able to map 14, 15 stops, you have to work kind of hard to get that much. You're not always going to require all of it. But the paramount thing for live is we need to map this onto a video signal that already exists.
Yeah.
So there are ways of recording more or creating more, which is using the raw, but I don't have a raw switcher, and raw recorders require, so this would allow a switcher that's been designed for standard dynamic range or just 4K to be able to pass these signals into this switcher or to this router or to any of the devices in the chain. It just looks like a video signal and can be handled like a video signal. So it's a means to an end for us, but a very high quality means to an end. And on the EOTF side, the X300 monitors or the X550 monitors totally understand this curve and can represent it. So it can be used for painting and grading as well as display. So
the products that are in the market today, and we can speak to, of course, the Sony products,
Yeah.
those are HDR ready from an acquisition
Yeah,
perspective,
on
and
the-
production perspective.
most of the higher end 4K products, absolutely.
Yeah. Is there anyone else that's doing HDR that are notable, whether it be here or worldwide?
Yeah, Sky did a really complete test, and there's some extra boxes. So the first box is kind of what we did at Sony Open, where we had 4K cameras, 4K switchers, 4K display, and kind of an island. But they took it one step further. They
Sure.
tried to go through the production steps that any event would have to go through. So contribution layers, what does an E&G roll look like this, or historical footage? You know, if I have to convert something, how is that going to affect the viewer experience? And then I've got to encode this because, of course, I can't use all of the links. The contribution to the satellite link is relatively bandwidth limited because it was all designed around the backbone. You know, HD was a big signal not all that long ago, right?
Yep.
So 25 megabits is 1.5 gigabits per second times 4. You know, it's so much larger than this contribution. So this has got to be squeezed and encoded at a very high quality rate, so you don't lose this beautiful signal that you've created to your compression engine. And how does that look? Because that's real world. We're going to end up having to do that. If I'm going to produce this golf event next year in Hawaii, I have to get it off the island for people to see it. I'm going to have to go through some of these links. So how does that look like?
Sure.
And then after we get through the uplink and the downlink, how is this going to look once we get it through a cable head end and get that to a consumer? So all this work that we do up front, is that going to carry through to a better viewing experience at the end? And the answer is yes. What I liked about this test is they did HLG in 2020 flavors, and they also did Rec 709 and BT 2020. So they have both major color spaces and the two most popular flavors of HDR that would end up at a home monitor. And most home monitors, if not virtually all of them at this point, are 2020 based.
Got you.
So it's important that we know that. So very, very complete test and what they thought was successful. And this next diagram, I just, it's a little playful because I can't go through all of it, but everything that we just described on the last diagram is the first 3 boxes in the cloud on this diagram. So there's still a lot of other things that we need to worry about in a plant. How do we mix commercials in with master control and all of the things that a normal broadcast plant does, as well as a layer of OTT on top of it. So, it's we're not saying that this is easy. At its essence, it seems very straightforward, but there's a lot of considerations a broadcaster needs to be able to make this successful.
So with that said, I mean, all this work you're going to put in, and again, I use the term all this work very loosely because your production workflow effectively remains the same as long as you have the equipment that can handle the HDR. What does the end user see at home? What is the impact for them, and what do they need to really take advantage of all this work that the content creators are doing in the field?
Because at the end of the day, if it's not something kind of wonderful, it's lost. And you and I have the benefit of seeing the direct output, 10-bit, 4K, never stepped on, absolute finest video on the best displays. Maybe not this neighborhood, but everywhere else in the United States, the experience is somewhat different, right? So how does a consumer-grade television, although a premium one, and your local signal provider, how do they get along, and what's going to be at the end of it? So as in anything else, there is standards, and because of the pioneering work in motion picture, a lot of this has been worked out and is ready, and moving to the live part of it isn't a giant leap. But the CEA or CHA has been working in the background to define a standard. First they defined what UHD was and what that meant, and then on top of that they've defined UHD-A, which is 4K with HDR, and they didn't want to do this in isolation, so there's a group of companies that have come together to establish what these standards should be, and they put out a paper on what a set needs to qualify for that. At CES this year, and then at NEB, we showed this phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal home receiver that's built to up to a 4,000 nit standard, which would be everything that you could throw at it in this generation of equipment. And it looked, 75 inch, huge, beautiful experience. It really is breathtaking. And we had taken files that we had shot, some of the Jackson Hole and this Vegas overhead footage, and instead of cheating and putting, taking our premium recording device and putting that directly in the TV, we encoded these files in what these files would be likely transmitted to from your
home.
Yeah, that last mile, and played that instead. And we were able to identify, look, there are, in any television, there's going to be something suboptimal, or we wouldn't, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But absolutely fabulous viewing experience. Really, really, and
some of that
it's really something.
That Las Vegas footage is some of the best I've seen.
Yeah,
in my entire
it's
time.
it's a great example too, because you've got a lot of contrast in there and a ton of detail, and
Got you.
yeah, really, really fabulous. And makes me impressed. And what we've created is an over-the-top service. So Sony Pictures has been mastering movies. That's what we do. We've gone back into the archive and regraded several movies for HDR and have put them on this download service. And this is also offered by Amazon and Netflix and others that you can do over-the-top services. And again, this is the difference between live and dramatic, where you have the time to download this.
Yeah.
You have time to create another version of it. So to do 4K HD live, we're going to rely on the traditional broadcast links at first before the over-the-top has the and it's also a rights issue at the moment. So there has been some streaming of different sports, but to get the big pipe and the big games, it's still going to take a change. We went through the same thing in 3D, where nobody had there wasn't alternative rights for 3D. You still had to work with the people who own them at present, so it was difficult to get premium content.
Sure.
So we have to work with the content right holders now, but these services are available and are in market. So.
Got you. Well, I think now may be a good time, because there's been a lot of information that we just discussed about, the academics of it, the practicality of it, and you did mention a number of products. So what I'd like to do for the benefit of the end users at home is to run through some of the products that you discussed in the actual tests that we've done and the actual productions that we've done. So looking at the product, this has been our focus. With HDR at the very center of it, you have high luminance, high resolution, and things like that. And we have products in the market today, like we said, originally designed for cinematic applications like our F65 and our F55. We introduced the HDC 4300 last year, primarily, of course, for live applications, but has some cinematic roles as well, in addition to our BVM X300, which is the master reference monitor for both 4K and high dynamic range. So like I said, HDC 4300 brought to the market. This is a 3-chip, 2/3 inch native 4K camera that can also give you that HDR output. So you can have simultaneous 4K, you can have with your HDR, and you also have the benefit of being able to do HD high frame rate and 4K high frame rate. It'll do HD high frame rate up to 8 times, and it'll do 4K high frame rate up to 2 times. So that's 120 frames per second. At this IBC, which is actually, I believe, ending today, we also introduced the brand new HDC P43, which gives you the same functionality, 4K, HD, high frame rate, and HDR acquisition in a point of view or box style camera. So now you have a perfect companion camera that you can utilize for your live events, sports or concerts, entertainment, what have you, that can give you everything that the HDC 4300 can, but in a smaller form factor. At this past NAB, we also introduced our HDC 4800, and this is our ultra high frame rate camera, also HDR capable, but this camera leverages a super 35mm image sensor that can also output 4K up to 8 times. So that's 480 frames per second in 4K, or up to 16 times, 960 frames per second in HD. So now you have a powerful tool set. It works as a great complement to your HDC 4300 and your HDC P43, both for 4K, high definition, high frame rate, or high dynamic range productions. That's on the acquisition side. On the recording side, we have the PWS 4500. Now this is our 4K IP HD production server powerhouse. It can record natively in 10-bit XAVC, maintaining that EOTF and OETF information that Rob was describing earlier, because it records natively in XAVC. But optionally, you can also record in ProRes or in DNx HD. From a display perspective, you have the BVM X300. This is a 30-inch OLED master reference monitor. It is effectively the industry standard now for review and mastering and grading of 4K content. It's a 30-inch OLED display. And at this NAB, we introduced the PVM X550, which is a companion to the X300, but can also be used on its own as well, but is a 55-inch OLED HDR capable display, which can be used for client monitoring, or actually can also be used in rooms, locker rooms, or owners' suites, or things like that. That's why we brought the 550 to the market as well. And you can also look at it as a great solution for a multi-viewer screen if you're within a production truck environment.
Yeah. The real cool thing about that device too is you could have SDR on one screen, HDR on another screen, 2084 on the third screen, and HLG. So you could mix flavors of dynamic range, color space, and HDR, SDR on one monitor and compare them dynamically. It's
Absolutely right.
Really neat. Very handy.
What's brand new and really kind of represents one of the game changers in the market is our HDRC 4000. And this is an HDR production converter unit. And what this box actually allows you to do is not only go from high def up to 4K UHD, but it can also go in between your various HDR formats or from S-Log to your desirable HDR format. So you can acquire using S-Log 3. Your entire live production can be maintained utilizing S-Log 3, which is your OETF curve. And then you can do your full production. And then at the very end, you can convert to the HDR format that you choose. So you can go to a HLG curve. You can also look at going from standard dynamic range to high dynamic range. So think of this as a box that allows you to go through the transition. You can go from your current production allotment today, with the HDRC 4000, you can get and start playing in that HDR realm. And then when you're ready, you can start to acquire those HDR ready products and put on an end-to-end HDR based production in the future. And that's, again, a small sampling of what we have in the way of HDR ready products right now. And I'm actually going to ask Rob, so what do you want end users to really, or the viewers, to take away from the overall presentation that we've just done on HDR?
Well, I think the big one is that it's an incremental approach to production. So we don't need to, we can still do and respect our HD broadcast, our standard definition broadcast, and have this running on top. And again, the great difficulty and failure of 3D was you had to do a separate production with a separate crew and double up in events, and it wasn't bringing you any new eyeballs.
Yeah.
So the hope here is that this will be very compelling and bring a new audience to existing sports. It may take sports that aren't as popular or growing in popularity and be able to get a new audience for them because it's new and vibrant and colorful and immersive and all of those adjectives that we use today to be able to describe them. But and things like lensing and switchers and common operator experience, and it's not a whole new genre.
Sure.
And again, 3D was bespoke equipment, bespoke crew, everything was new and a little fragile, and we used to kind of joke that we were sort of assembling the aircraft while it was going down the runway.
Sure.
And I don't think that there's enough experience with this. We're just taking what we've already been doing in the cinema space and moving that to the live space.
The live space. Okay, great. I think now may be a great time for us to open the floor for questions, and I think we've gotten some questions that have already come in. So let's start addressing some of your questions right now. So here's a question from Matt, and it's asked, do Sony's HDR products also support HLG SMPTE 2020?
So the short answer is HLG and S-Log are relatively similar. So for a curve that doesn't rely on metadata, we can support it. And we've done variants of software where we would support HLG from the back of the camera as experiments. But right now, what we're looking at doing is S-Log for the main work and then a conversion to HLG.
Understood. Okay, here's a question from Chris. What is Sony's product plan regarding BT 2020?
Secret.
Secret.
It's for our 4K production devices. To me, it's an opportunity to reset the production bar, and cameras like the 4800 and the P43 and 4300 all already support 2020, or the majority coverage of 2020, as we showed on the S-Gamut chart.
Sure.
So that's definitely part of the experience. And I don't feel that you can have HDR without that color space. It just doesn't have the impact. There's a bunch of practical problems to work out with delivery and broadcast and infrastructure, but from a raw imaging standpoint, I don't think anything can beat 4K in 2020.
Okay. Got you. All right. Next question is from Jan. Can we see the SDR and HDR difference done on the Par 3 Sony Open? Wow, that was specific. Okay. Can we bring that slide back up by chance? I think we have. Okay.
I'll just happen to have it up here.
All right.
So I'm trying to think of the question. If you mean from a monitoring standpoint, if I had an HDR monitor beside the SDR monitor, which we did, the immediate, there's two things. One of them is the 2020 space. You immediately look at the other monitor and go, oh God, I want that.
Yeah.
One thing that we had done, we had two of the same monitors, and we had an 88 times lens in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And we were outside on a deck, and the sun had moved from behind the building to in front of the building and was shining directly on the monitors. And the HDR screen was so bright, it just, compared to the LCD that was standard definition, which when you looked at it was black, and this one looked like a postcard. So from a viewing experience, it is completely different. What I noticed the most was the ability to capture some of the odd clothing choices that golfers can make.
Sure.
And some colors just aren't 709 friendly. Like, there's a lot of guys who like wearing shocking pink and those deep magentas, and they just on standard dynamic range cameras just do not translate very well.
I think the term is avant-garde.
Avant-garde.
Avant-garde. Okay, here's a question from Phil. What is the cost to produce in HDR? And I think I can probably answer that. And it really is relative. It comes down to, are you recording and going into post with your content? Are you shooting in live?
Yeah.
We have cameras like our F5. We have cameras like our FS5 and FS7, which are being used to bring this broadcast to you today. And if you pair that with something like a raw recorder or something that can record that S-Log 3 signal, you have the ability in post to convert that into a high dynamic range output.
Yeah.
And from a live side, we just went through a litany of the products that include our 4300, the P43, our F55, which also comes in a live configuration. All of those cameras can also give you an HDR signal. The 4500 can record your XAVC, which will give you a 10-bit HDR, and you have something like a BVM X300 or a PVM X550, which can also give you your HDR display output. So it really depends on the type of application you're in, whether it's recorded for post or if it's for live, and it also depends on your equipment choices, of course. So it ranges. It's hard to answer that question with a definitive dollar amount.
Yeah, I think it comes down to intent too. So if you started your project saying this is going to be an HDR project, I think that you're going to plan for that through post, and you're going to create your SDR either from the HDR master or on a parallel path, but you're going to make all of your bigger decisions on the HDR. So I think it's additive, it's not a multiplier.
Sure, agreed. Okay, unfortunately, I think we are out of time, so I apologize if we weren't able to get to answer your question. However, if you do still have questions, I would strongly recommend that you reach out to your Sony account manager or your Sony authorized resellers. They are all very knowledgeable about the concept of high dynamic range, or they can at least put you in contact with someone who is if they can't answer your questions immediately. I also recommend you visit the sony.com/HDR website. There's a lot of valuable information on that site as it relates to our products, as it relates to techniques, and some of the goings-ons currently in the market as it relates to high dynamic range. You can also visit sony.com/sports for give you some updates on what we're doing on the sports realm. With that, I'd like to thank you, Rob, for joining us today. I'd like to thank all of you who are watching this stream right now for giving us the time to share some of this information with you. Please look forward to the next Sony Pro Live event, which I'm sure will be communicated to you via email or through social media. With that said, again, thank you guys for the time and have a great day.